Hey guys, Chris here with OmniMetrix, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome to the very first episode of the OmniCast podcast. That's right, on a monthly basis on this channel, I will be going through all things OmniMetrix, sitting down with our team members, going through history, going through some benefits of our products and solutions, and maybe some other things that you may not even know about. So I'm very, very excited to bring this to you. And with our first episode, our very first guest is Jarrett, the founder of OmniMetrix. Some of you may know Harold, some of you may not be familiar with Harold, but I'm going to have a brief conversation with him and really go in depth on the history of OmniMetrix and what it was like when our company was founded 30 years ago to where he sees the industry going over the next 30 or so years. So without further ado, I'm very excited to bring in our guest, Harold. Harold, how are you doing today?
I am good, thanks. Glad to be online with you.
Well, it's great to have you on, sir, and I'll just jump right in. So, first question would be, what made you want to start OmniMetrix almost 30 years ago?
The genesis of OmniMetrix comes from a project that my longtime friend and Omni coworker, Charlie Jenkins, and I were working on in the middle 90s, and that had to do with creating a solution to remotely control lottery billboard numbers. The issue was at the time that they were manually hanging giant numbers on billboards every week, and it was very laborious and very expensive to them. And so they were interested in having remotely controlled numbers so that it could say 13 million today and 17 million tomorrow. And of course, these days we're accustomed to seeing that everywhere. That was something that ultimately did become a market, but we were very, very early in that process, and we were using the technology of the time, which was the one-way pager product that, I guess you have to be of a certain age to know what that is, but it was a very, very solid, extremely reliable one-way data product that was adaptable to being able to pass small amounts of information, small messages, or in our case, to cause things to happen. And so we were developing around that one-way process, and the customer, the Georgia Lottery people, decided that they really wanted to have a two-way product so that they could have confirmation that if we sent 17 million, that it actually said 17 and not 71. Or and at the time, there just flat was not a meaningful two-way wireless product that was appropriate for that application. And as I was working on and researching for that opportunity, a friend of mine who worked for Pactel at the time made mention to me that Bell South was bringing to market a new product, a new data product that was called Telemetry, which was a very primitive two-way product, but it was a product that ran across the 1G cellular network. And of course, that's where we were in the middle 90s. So it was pretty magic that this technology was coming along. At the time, the cellular business was extremely fragmented. That business had started up with a lot of small cellular companies in different geographic locations, and the whole system really didn't get knitted together very well into a single cellular system until the first half of the 2000 decade. Because of that fractured nature, the different cell companies didn't communicate with each other, and so for all of this stuff that we think of today as being sort of ubiquitous cellular data, that was an impossibility at the time because those carriers were unrelated. And the mergers that took place along the way that essentially brought us from having hundreds of carriers down to 3 or 4 today, that whole merging of that patchwork of cellular companies has enabled the things that we do today. And so, but in those early days, it was for the first time an opportunity to be able to put a widget on a machine at an arbitrary place and pass data from that machine into a place remotely where it could be analyzed. And that was the essence of what I undertook, trying to find a solution to use it. It was, I guess, it was a solution looking for a problem, and I like that. And so it was that sort of looming opportunity to solve problems with new tools that was the essence of why I undertook OmniMetrix.
Wow, that's crazy to think that all this came from really the Georgia lottery billboards. Because being an Atlanta native myself, going up and down the highways, I remember as a kid, you'd see the lottery signs, and you kind of don't think that they think about the fact that they used to be, those big plywood pieces, and you'd have to swap them out, like almost how they would do the old scoreboards at, big sporting venues, or even like I think of the baseball scoreboard at Wrigley Field or anything. So it's very interesting, and I had heard from some of the team here that that it was a unique story, and they kind of said, "Hey, has Harold ever told you this?" And I was like, "No," and I was like, "Don't surprise me," but they were like, "Yeah, it's a pretty unique story how it came." I'm also going to date myself because I do remember Bell South as a kid, and all the phone carriers and how they kind of a lot of the little ones kind of converged into one, but I did not realize that Pactel became Verizon as well. So again, another thing that I learned in this conversation already.
Yeah, if you think about back to the billboard thing, the numbers were 8 feet tall. And so we're talking about nominally a sheet of plywood that somebody had to climb that board and go up there and hang it in the wind. And there was nothing fun about that.
Well, and you have to think it's billboards all over the metro area, and anyone who hasn't been, you don't realize how many there is. So it's not even just the wind that you have to deal with those big pieces of plywood. I mean, you think about some of the rain, some people call it snow, but it's more so ice down here, or even some of the extreme heat. I mean, that just that really sounds like just a nightmare job having to go up and change those, at least in my eyes.
Well, and I spent my share of time on billboards in those days, learning the ins and outs of that, and likewise, my enjoyment of heights has diminished over time, let's just say, and you can get a good dose of height on a billboard.
Yeah, I always tell people that I don't have a fear of heights. This is something that, as I've said, especially getting older, but I don't have a fear of heights. I just have developed more of a respect for heights as I've gotten older. So,
You have a fear of that height diminishing quickly.
Yes, exactly.
yeah, it's a very cool story, and I would have never thought that. So, really knowing kind of the backstory, what got you in the direction of doing remote monitoring for generators and critical equipment, I should say specifically, because it's obviously a little bit different, but really kind of what got you there?
Well, Charlie and I were working on a specific application, but I had, of course, studied remote monitoring in school. I'm a Georgia Tech electrical engineering type, and that was one of the things that was part of our curriculum, and so I had awareness of that, and of course, in prior business, we had done plenty of data collection, so the fundamentals I understood. Back at that time, remote monitoring then and now was largely considered to be a wired technology, and it could be just running wires outside to a wind speed sensor, and that would be considered remote monitoring, or it could be running wires to a water tank to know what level was in it. That was remote monitoring. And so, the world is full of remote monitoring of things if you broaden the definition to that point. The thing that was intriguing was that with the emergence of that telemetry product, now we could talk about having direct access to a water level, a fuel level, a kilowatt value or whatever at an arbitrary location without having to run wires for miles or cross continents and that kind of stuff. So that opportunity to have the ability to connect to widgets that connect to a fixed infrastructure for the delivery of the data, that was very transformative, and so that's what led to my desire to apply that technology to something. And the decision to apply it preceded by quite a while actually finding the application. Again, I was walking around with a solution looking for a problem for quite a while. So that's where that came from.
Well, very cool. So, kind of piggybacking on that, what was the first product or solution that OmniMetrix came out with, and I mean, what was it called? What did it do, and how did you apply it? I have a feeling I know the answer based on some of the conversations that I had going into this, but really, tell me a little bit more about those first products, or first product or solution.
Well, keeping in mind that the work that we did from the sort of late 90s, let's just say when the Olympics were in Atlanta was nominally when we were engaged in all of that kind of formative research, and in 96. And so it was the opportunity that was the lure. I didn't have a preferred application. And along the way, somehow or other, I met some DNR kind of people who were interested in monitoring lakes and rivers and dams, and very specifically, they were concerned about rapidly rising water levels in lakes that could put dams at risk. And so I spent a fair amount of time building prototype solutions for that. And along the way, the DNR guy I was working with fell off a roof and died. And even though that technology and that market came along some years later, I didn't have time to wait. And so, I started over essentially looking for different opportunities. And I thought the electric power place might be good. After all, I'm an electrical engineer. That's sort of what we tend to think about. But so I have good friends at Jackson Electric, where I live, and I sat down with them and talked to them about applications for utility, and there were some. But they are the ones who recommended that I look at the emergency generator application and gave me some names and numbers at the time. And so I did, in fact, call and met up with a friend who was the head of the Nixon Power Group in Georgia. And he said, oh, you mean that this widget you're showing me could send me a message saying that a machine was out of fuel? And I said, yes, that's what it's about. And he said, let's talk. And we sat down at the conference table there at his office, and we sketched out what became the first products. And it was with his company that it did first business. So the earliest products again, going back to telemetry, which I mentioned, which is a very crude early form of data transport, which gave us the ability to move an entire 4-byte packet, 32 whole bits could we move in one transmission. And again, extraordinarily crude in today's terms, but at the time that was good enough. That machine had a half a dozen alarm relays that would close if something was wrong, like low fuel or over temperature or whatever, those kinds of things. And so we conjured up what we would do about connecting to those alarm relays, sending alarm messages, and that became the essence of what OmniMetrix is. The first product I called a G3000, G for generator. It would have been G3 for 3 inputs, but it didn't sound big enough, so we made it G3000, and then later we bumped that up to G6000 with 6 whole inputs, and then others followed. And in particular, once we got off of the first gen of cellular and got to the 2G times where we could move more data, then we pretty much redefined what made the product. As it turns out, our products developed as the cellular system developed simultaneously. The power gen manufacturers were making more sophisticated genset controls. And so it all sort of went along together that we paralleled their sophistication, and that allowed us to make much more powerful, more capable devices. In those early days, the byword from the telemetry, the Bell South telemetry folks, was send a little bit of data, very seldom. And of course, these days, people send megabytes an hour or whatever, right? But back then it was, try not to send more than 1 message a day if you can stand it.
Yeah, just make sure you don't crash the system, right?
Yeah, they were concerned at the time about the impact that this stuff might have on their core money-making voice network. Yeah, I mean, there was good reason, because they were sort of experimenting at the time into can we get from here to data? And at the time, the answer was not so much. And honestly, it took them quite a while to get there. The Nextel people actually were significantly ahead in terms of having a network that actually could pass data. And we used Nextel for 2 or 3 years before the AT&T Verizon kind of folks finally migrated over into 2G and had put together, had sort of spliced together all of that mishmash of small companies around the country. The Nextel guys at least had their own network, so they were just simply way ahead in building out a data network. And but eventually we did have to migrate over onto the AT&T and Verizon stuff. We've stuck largely with AT&T because of the early days with Bell South, and they're headquartered in Atlanta, and so it just made it much more simple to do business with them. And even today, that's still our primary partner.
Very cool. Now, something interesting to me with something you just said, being the marketing managers, I had no idea that the G stood for generator in the G8500 or some of those products. Been here for years, and especially when you come on board to a company that's been established as long as OmniMetrix has, you do kind of want to dive into naming and really kind of, being involved with the Omni and Omni Pro launch and branding those products, creating the logo. As a marketer and marketing manager, you really kind of want to put the good branding and the stamp behind the product. And it's just cool to kind of learn not only how they were named, because it was something I had not learned, and it's kind of ironic. It kind of, paired up even with some of the things of my thought process and in those brand developments with the Omni and Omni Pro, but really just also cool how you really kind of had this solution and you went out and found the problem to apply it to. That's really something very, very cool.
Yeah, we had a couple of other things that came and went that had their own names that weren't generator things. And we spent some time in the concrete business. And so there was, and ultimately we backed out of that. But yeah, we did the same stuff there, named differently. So anyway, we have done some other things, but the G was the designator for generator.
So going to your comment on the early days and especially me knowing how the company is now, how big was the company back in the beginning? I know Charlie, you had mentioned he was heavily involved in the inception, and I knew he had been around with the company for a while, but did not realize he was kind of with you even in the Georgia Lottery days. That's really, really cool to hear, and especially with how often I work with Charlie and see him around the office. But really, what were those early years like? Maybe some of the good and bad things that you guys experienced.
The head count was exactly one for a long time, and that would be this head. And it was very much a garage startup. It literally was a garage startup. And even when we outgrew the garage and moved to a metal building, which was still an insult to garages, it was a long time before we had a glorious place that we would invite anybody to come see us, and years actually. So Charlie and I, and again, we've just been great friends for a very long time, but he has always been my go-to when, I'm good for prototyping things, but when it's time to make a producible widget, I have never tried to convince anybody that was my strength. That's clearly Charlie's strength. And so his fingerprints have been on everything that we've ever built at Omni. And then probably the first actual employee, because who was working for the company full time, was Burke Smith, and Burke is an Omni person again today after years and years of our not having worked together. But he and I also worked together at a previous company called Systronics, and so that part's been pretty fun. But he came in and actually built the products, stuffed components on bare circuit boards and that kind of stuff. Again, this was in the days of through-hole electronics, and so it was before the pick and place surface mount kind of stuff. So, but he was one of the first people who actually built and tested the devices. And
wow, that's crazy. I am going to interrupt you just for the purpose of this. So, for those of you watching this who have called into tech support and you've heard OmniMetrix tech support, this is Burke speaking. The Burke Smith that Harold is talking about is the same Burke. I see Burke every day, work with him every day, love him, great guy. But I knew he had been with the company previously and come back, but I did not realize that Burke was actually employee number 2. So very cool to kind of learn that, especially it's again, Burke's a great guy, love working with him, and a great asset to the team.
Yeah, yeah. So as for the question of the good, bad, and the ugly, I think a big thing learned is we tackled trying to bring a brand new technology to an industry that is not known for taking risks. They are very conservative. the fundamentals of how power is generated today is not dramatically different than how it was generated 100 years ago. You still got big rotating magnetic fields and coils and such, and you got more sophisticated controls. But the core of power generation is very slow moving, and trying to get those folks to say that yes, this nascent wireless technology could have any meaning to them was very challenging. In fact, part of the issue was that we would talk about, we can send you a message to say that that something's gone wrong with the generator. And pretty much universally, those generator people would look at me and say, we don't have things that go wrong with our generators. And we're not about to advertise that we do. And so there was this whole thing about they're just not even wanting to talk about gen failures. And that was, at the time, that was really what we were focusing on. And we did. I learned to stop talking about that and instead to migrate the conversation to we provide daily confirmations of the performance of your machine. And even as we were sending messages about that kind of stuff, we really did try to rebuild the concept of, we're not sending you messages about failures. We're sending information that says the machine working as it should, and this message brought to you by brand X. And so again, that trying to dive into a conservative, slow-moving marketplace with shiny new widgets, I wouldn't recommend for anybody. That was very hard, and it took a very long time to get through that. Of course, startup taking a long time equals money issues. And because you think, I mean, and I will say this was me, I built this glorious spreadsheet with growth curves and the billions of dollars that were going to be made and all of that in 1997. And the reality is that we had to change the market, and it was very hard. And we wouldn't be here today were it not for our very dear friend Glenn Robinson, who became an investor in the probably in the 1999-2000 range, and it was his financial depth and his willingness to stick with us and his patience we were doing, to which we can attribute our presence today, because we certainly had plenty of opportunities to have run out of money and said, this is too hard, see ya. So to Glenn, who has unfortunately passed, we are forever indebted. And of course, his picture is there on the wall at OmniMetrix as a thanks for all that he did.
Yep, I see that picture every morning when I walk in. So, so on that, another thing I'll ask you about the early days in the older or original technology. I'll say original, so I don't have to use the old word. Can you go a little more in detail on how the technology compared back then to now? I know we discussed the 2D or 2G, excuse me, and the size of information traveling and how much more information you can send. But seeing these wireless companies not being too risky, as you mentioned, what was kind of the technology and maybe even some of the advancements you have seen that have really helped the industry grow and get over some of those hurdles, especially from back in the early days?
Well, To their credit, the Bell South people did the early work to try to solve um, how to make their network more usable beyond just voice. And that early telemetry product, yeah, it was good enough for us to create a business around. And um, and thankfully they didn't stop there. And so by the time, let's call it 2005 or so, when 2G came into play, and prior to that, with the Nextel IDEN product, that was a bona fide data-enabled network from the term IDEN. We had the opportunity to grow our processes, to pass more data, to do more elaborate things, to have a better balance of bidirectional data, open the door to being able to reprogram the devices over the air, which turned out to be an essential part of the business. So that part about getting to 2G was a huge change. And quite honestly, from our perspective, from yours and mine, if I could have 2G back, I would. That for us, 3G, 4G, LTE, 5G, none of those, the different number in front of the generation, has brought little real benefit to us once 2G arrived. And it's also made challenges for us, because when they bring end of life to one generation, and that sort of strands equipment with out-of-date methodologies. So we can do much more, but it also came at the expense of the moving target of what's the hardware in the field. The benefit of the greater technology in the cellular space that I mentioned, in parallel with the programming methodologies and the embedded devices that we use, those things got better through those years. And likewise, the power gen manufacturers, the Caterpillars and the Kohlers and the Cumminses and those kind of folks, they all were likewise building more computerized controls. So the controls of the mid-90s were what would be considered relay logic, essentially no smarts at all. And by the middle 2000 decade, certainly by the end of the 2000 decade, pretty much all of the big name controls were all microcontroller based. And as part of that, they started sharing data from those controls. So we were able to design our products to play with their products in order to suck the data out of the product, pass consequential amount of information back to our database to keep up with histories, so that you could see demand curves, or you could see fuel consumption, or you could see temperature variations, or battery charging voltages, that kind of stuff. So it moved us from being more alarm oriented to positioning for prognostic, predictive kinds of solutions. And so in general, my position has been for about the last 20 of our years that more data is good data. And so OmniMetrix, in large part because I just sort of forced the issue, has been focused on extracting more data for diagnostic, prognostic purposes.
All very, very good stuff, and very, very, it's again, this is all very cool stuff for me to hear. So last question, and it's a two-part that I have for you, is what are you most proud of that OmniMetrix has accomplished over the last 30 years? And where do you see the industry going, specifically OmniMetrix going, over the next 30 years?
I am most proud that we still are in business. I have seen there have been others that have come and gone who have appeared and to challenge us and try to get a toehold in the markets that we serve, and they have come and they've gone. And the bottom line is this stuff isn't easy, and it looks easy from the outside, but when you get serious about it, yeah, doing it right is hard. And so I'm really proud about that. I'm proud that we've employed a lot of good people and have helped some them with career paths that it's a good thing that we've done. And I'm proud that have pretty continually pushed the envelope in our market, and that we've tried to produce the most sophisticated products and solutions for that marketplace. And I feel like we've succeeded well at that. And so I'm proud of all of those things. As relates to 30 years, my gosh, 30 years ago, we couldn't have imagined where we would be today. I mean, the science fiction might have been able to talk about artificial intelligence, for example, but 30 years ago, we wouldn't have believed it. So I think in the markets that we serve today, which are in large part related to power generation, and who knows, we might branch off, we might redirect. There might be great opportunities in places we don't know about. But in the space that we populate today, I think that the tools that we're developing and the tools that are becoming available to us make us much more applicable and appropriate to play in that space. Certainly, the power gen market in the broadest sense, sort of the utility scale power gen, they're still fighting a hard fight with trying to produce more power with limited resources, and a lot of people on the outside trying to tell them how to do their business and legislating them. And so they're in a hard place. And so having the tools that we have, making the power systems, including emergency power that we participate in, making all of that stuff be more connected to be smarter. And theoretically, you tie AI into that gigantic place, and it can only help with prediction and measurement and quality verification, that kind of stuff. Those tools can only make power generation better. And so I think that I don't view OmniMetrix as being in a place of risk. I feel like we are in a place where we do have good tools for an industry that needs them. So that part I feel strongly about.
Good deal. And I guess kind of a side question on that would be, would you think about going back to the Georgia Lottery on the 30-year anniversary and see if they need monitoring for old time's sake? Because, I mean, we may have the opportunity now.
Yeah, actually, it would be fun. That specific application that Charlie and I were working on, it was a very big uphill battle because there were players in that billboard space that wanted that business, and it was going to be really hard to displace them. But it was we had a fine time participating there. But still, just the idea of 30 years ago, we barely had email. And when I started going around and knocking on doors for OmniMetrix, and I had my little handheld telemetry device, it looked like a walkie-talkie, and I said, check this out, I'm going to push this alarm button, and then my pager on my belt rang. And because I didn't have a cell phone at the time, and or at least I didn't have a cell phone that could get a message. I guess that was the real issue, was that you could get a phone call to your cell phone, but that was it. And so we were trying to we were sending we were sending fax messages to people, and before SMSs existed. So it's very hard to imagine, these days, what we walk around with in our hands. You don't need to look at a billboard. The marketing is direct to your hand now, not to something you see while you're driving. So it's hard to know. We'll probably have implants, and we don't even we won't have to carry anything. We'll just be wired in 30 years. I don't know.
Yeah, you never know. I was actually tempted to interrupt you and say, hey, for those of you watching who don't know, a pager was it's a little box that's about, this big that you put in your pocket. And back in the day, it would notify you if someone needed to get a hold of you or was looking for you. So there may be some people watching that don't know what a pager is.
And for those people, those same 20 somethings, that pager meant that you had to pull your car over, get out of the car at the phone booth to use the payphone to call the number that showed up on your pager. So
Correct. And if you didn't have any change, you would have to do something called collect calling, which, for those of you watching who don't know what collect calling is, you can Google it once you're done with this conversation and learn a little bit more about the subject. Harold, I greatly appreciate the time. I know we've been talking for a while now, but this has been very, very exciting, very beneficial to me. We greatly appreciate everything that you've done for the company. Me personally, if you didn't create the company, I wouldn't be here as well, so I appreciate you for that. But we definitely want to thank you in everything that you have done for the organization and everything you continue to do. And I look forward to celebrating the next 30 years of OmniMetrix success with you.
I hope to be around 30 years from now to celebrate with you.
I do as well, sir. Well, I've kept you for a long time. I won't keep you any longer. So I do thank you for coming by. And those of you viewing, appreciate you checking out the first episode of the OmniCast podcast. And we will see you in the next one.